welcome back to BHookedCrochet.com. I'm your host Brittany, and in today's video I'm going to demonstrate how to crochet the woven mittens. This is a free pattern that's available at BHookedCrochet.com. You can find the link to that pattern in the description below. To complete one pair of woven mittens, you're going to need 2 skeins of Peyton's color wool in the colorway of your choice, a size 5.5mm hook, a darning needle, and a pair of scissors. To begin crocheting our mittens, we need to first start off with a slip knot. And now we need to chain 35. The interesting part about this pattern is that it takes a different approach to creating mittens than probably what you're used to. So we're actually going to be working the mittens in a single row. So we're just going to crochet back and forth. We're not going to work in rounds, and doing this makes these a lot easier to work with, and even people who are beginners or advanced beginners can have a good chance of completing this pattern. So with that in mind, the next step that we want to do is to slip stitch in the second chain from the hook. So we're going to skip this stitch right here. That's the first chain from the hook. Then we want to insert our hook into that second chain. Then grab the yarn and pull through, and then pull through the loop on our hook. We want to make our slip stitches a little bit loose. That way we don't mess up our tension, and that way we can keep it uniform throughout. So we want to do that 2 more times for a total of 3 slip stitches. And the part of the mitten that we're working on here is the part that's going to be right at the top of your fingers. So by making a slip stitch, what we do is we create a pull in the fabric. Since these stitches are much shorter than the rest of the stitches we're going to be used for the pattern, it's going to pull them in, and that way it's going to help us to create a drawstring bind off to form up the fingers. Next, we want to make a single crochet into the next chain, and then single crochet 1 more time into the next chain. And we're continuing the shaping of the finger there, so we're just kind of creating a gradient. So we're going down a little bit more uniformly. The next thing we want to do is create a woven stitch. Now this is the backbone of this pattern, and it's a really cool stitch once you get the hang of it, but it's so different compared to all of the other stitches that you're probably used to. So to make the woven stitch, what you want to do is wrap the yarn around the hook. We're going to go right into the next chain, then yarn over and pull up a loop, and then here's where it gets different. We want to take this last loop and pull it through this one. So what I do, it gets a little bit fiddly, but I like to take my middle finger to kind of push that loop up as I bring it under that stitch or that loop. Then we want to yarn over and pull through both of the loops on our hook. Now that doesn't complete the woven stitch, that's just step 1. What we want to do to finish the stitch is again yarn over. We're going to go into the same chain that we just worked into, then yarn over and pull up a loop. Now what we want to do is pull this loop through both of the loops on our hook. And again, I use my middle finger back there to kind of help me through this process. But you'll just pull through both of those. Now that completes the woven stitch. So in order to keep our stitch count accurate, since technically we made 2 stitches in 1 chain, we need to skip a stitch or a chain in between each of the woven stitches. So that was 1 woven stitch. Now we want to work that same thing into this chain here. We're going to skip 1 and work into this one. Now skip a chain and work a woven stitch into the next one. And one of the things that I found really helps when working with this woven stitch is to make your stitches pretty loose. So if you're trying to make them too tight, then it's going to throw your tension off for the rest of the mitten, and it's going to look a little bit crooked. So we skip a chain, work into the next. Skip a chain, work into the next. And that's what your woven stitches will look like on this first row. Now they really start to take shape the more we advance through the pattern, but you should have something that looks like this. So we're about halfway through now. We need to have a total of 10 woven stitches. And remember, we're counting those 2 as 1. So we've got 1 woven stitch here, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So I need to add 5 more woven stitches. So once you have completed your 10 woven stitches, you will have worked through the hand portion of the mitten. So that's going to be everything from about here all the way back to here. And the next thing we want to do is start shaping the wrist portion. So it's going to look ribbed, and we're going to create that effect using single crochet stitches. So we need to make a single crochet into the next chain that's available. So I've got my last woven stitch here. I'm just going to work right into that chain, make a single crochet, and I want to do that for the next remaining 9 stitches. So we need to have a total of 10 single crochet for the wrist portion of our pattern. And counting your stitches as you go along for this first row is going to be the most important. It's going to give you the framework to complete the rest of your pattern. And so if you're off by 1 or 2 stitches, it's going to make a difference in how things progress. So you just want to make sure that you have your stitch counts correct for this first row, then everything else should be a piece of cake. So at the end of row 1, your work should look something like this. To begin row 2, we just want to chain 1 and turn our work. And since we're creating a ribbing effect here for the wrist part of the mitten, we want to work in the back loop only. And so by doing so, that's going to leave this loop exposed here, and it's going to give it that ribbing effect. So we've made our chain 1, and we just want to skip this first stitch here because that is where our chain 1 is going to count as a single crochet. So we want to make a single crochet into the back loop of the next stitch. So there technically is 2 stitches here because that chain 1 counts as 1. So we want to make a single crochet in the remaining single crochet stitches. So we should have a total of 10, including that chain 1. So now we're moving on to the woven section of the mitten. And so technically we're skipping the first stitch here and working the woven stitch into the next, but it's easier to eyeball it. If you want to look at it from the top, you can do so. I like to look at it from the side, and you can see that gap. So when I move my finger from the background, you can see that gap. That's where we're going to work all of the woven stitches, and it's going to look like that for each subsequent row. So we're skipping that first stitch. I'm working the woven stitch exactly like we did before into that opening right here, or that second stitch. Now we're going to skip that stitch if you're doing it that way, or you can just look for that next gap and then work your woven stitch there. And just like on round 1, we're going to have a total of 10 woven stitches. Here. And that last stitch is sometimes a little hard to see that back loop, but you should be able to just kind of wiggle it onto your hook and then finish off the slip stitch. Now that finishes row number 2. So row number 3 is actually exactly the same as row number 1. I'm going to go through it briefly here in the video just so you can get the hang of it. But up to this point, we have completed every single round that we're going to have to do in order to finish off the hand part of the mitten. So to begin row 3, you're going to chain 1 and turn your work. And we want to find that very next stitch. In the back loop only, we're going to make a slip stitch. And we'll do that for the next 2 stitches as well. Now make 1 single crochet into each of the next 2 stitches in the back loop only. Okay, that finishes off that section. Now we're moving on to the woven stitches, and this looks the same like I mentioned before. We want to work into the gap spaces there. So technically we're skipping a stitch and working the woven stitch into the next, which just happens to be where that big opening is. Now the last woven stitch is a little easier to see from this direction, but again, you want to make sure you don't skip it. You want to just get that last woven stitch and make sure that you have 10 woven stitches. Okay, so that's what your work should look like at this point. And you can see the finger part is really starting to pull down, and you're going to notice that the more rows you add on, it's going to get to the point where it almost starts curling, which is exactly what we want. Now once you've made that last woven stitch, we need to make 1 single crochet into each of the next 10 stitches, working in that back loop only. Okay, now when you get to the very end, if you're not used to using chain 1 or turning chains as a stitch, you might get a little confused here. So I just want to point out that looking at it from this direction, it looks like I only have 1 stitch left. And technically that is true. There is just 1 single crochet stitch left. But I want to remind you that the chain 1 are counting as stitches. So if you've been counting along as you go, I have 8 single crochets that I've made. I'm making my 9th single crochet into that last stitch, but I need to make sure that I have 10 total because the turning chain counts as a stitch. So I need to make a single crochet into the turning chain. Now I recommend if you're brand new at this, you might want to start marking your chains with a stitch marker. You could use a bobby pin or a scrap piece of yarn, or anything works. But I just typically like to eyeball it. I like to catch this loop that's right here and work my last single crochet right into there. The main thing you want to do is make sure you're consistent. It really doesn't matter where you're adding that last stitch. You just want to try to get it in that chain, and you want to keep doing that the same way throughout the rest of the pattern. So up until this point, I have fully demonstrated the row repeats for this pattern. So it's actually pretty simple. We're really just repeating 2 rows over and over until our mitten is a proper size for our hand. So I would say I would have a small hand. So for me, I need to keep crocheting until this piece measures 9 inches from the bottom all the way to the top. And at 9 inches, that will fit comfortably around my hand. If you have slightly bigger hands than I do, you might want to add a few more rows, just according to how it works for you. You'll find that just wrapping it around your hand as you're going along will kind of give you an idea of where you need to stop. So at this point, go ahead and finish crocheting the hand part of the mitten. Then once you've completed that, come back to this video and we'll talk about how to crochet the thumb. So now that we've finished the hand of our mitten, we need to proceed to making the thumb. And I'm just going to put this out there. This is going to be the most complicated part of this pattern. And it's not because it's super difficult to crochet, but we're going to be working in slip stitches and increases and decreases, and that can kind of confuse some people. Go ahead and pick up your yarn and create a slip knot. And when you do so, make yourself a real long tail. We're going to use this to sew the thumb together. So I've got myself about 10 inches here, and that should be good enough. Create the slip knot. And just like we did for the hand of the mittens, we're going to make the thumb a flat piece as well, and then we're going to sew it together to create the shape. So to begin, we just want to chain 15. What we want to do is skip the first chain from the hook, and we want to make a slip stitch into the next chain. And you want to make sure you're making your slip stitches pretty loose, because the looser you make them, the easier they are to work into. So what I do is just kind of exaggerate that motion where I'm pulling up and then I can just pull it right through that loop. So I let my hook kind of be my friend, determine the gauge. So push it up on the hook where you have the wider portion where it's the correct size for what we're working on, and then pull it through. Takes a little bit longer in doing it this way, but trust me, it is the easiest way that I have come up with. And so we're just making one slip stitch into every single chain. Now to move on to the second row of our thumb, we just want to keep something in mind, just the direction of what we're looking at here. Where my hook is now, that's going to be where the shaping occurs. So we're going to be decreasing so that it kind of goes off in this direction, and then increasing so it goes back up in that direction. But this side over here is going to remain completely straight. And that's because this is the top part of the thumb. So that's going to be what is right here, and where we've got that odd shape is going to fit into our thumb just like that. So what we want to do is chain one, turn our work. We're going to skip the first stitch. So we're skipping this one right here, and then we want to slip stitch in the back loop only of the next stitch. And then we'll slip stitch into each of the remaining stitches, and since we skipped that first stitch, or we decreased by one, we should have a total of 13 stitches for this row. Okay, so a quick count at the end of the row just to verify that we have 13 stitches, and we're ready to move on to the next row. To continue on with row 3, we just want to chain one and turn our work. And this is the flat side of the thumb. So we want to find that first stitch there and make a slip stitch into the first stitch, and now into the next 11 stitches. So we want 12 stitches total for row 3, and again this row we're decreasing by 1. Okay, so we have 12 stitches now. For row 3, we've skipped that last stitch here, and now we're ready to move on to row 4. For row 4, we're going to start by chaining one and turning our work. We're going to skip the first stitch and slip stitch into the back loop only of the next stitch. So we want to have a total of 11 stitches for row 4. For row 5, we want to chain one, turn our work. This is the flat side again, so we want to make sure we get that first stitch, make a slip stitch there. And we want to have a total of 10 stitches for row 5. So that was the first, so we'll make 9 more. Okay, so that finishes off row 5. Again, we've skipped that last stitch there. And now we can move on to row 6. So you're probably getting the hang of this by now. We're going to keep going row by row until we finish the thumb though, since this is the most complicated part of the pattern. So to begin row 6, we just want to chain one, turn our work, and we're decreasing again. So we want to skip that very first stitch and then slip stitch into the next. So for row 6, we need to have a total of 9 stitches. So that was our first. So we should have 8 remaining stitches. Now that finishes off row 6. Okay, so row 7 is what we're starting now. This is going to be the last row of decreasing to shape the thumb. So as you can see, this is the flat side of the thumb, so we want to make sure we hit that first stitch there. We want to make a slip stitch into that back loop only. And we need to have a total of 8 stitches for row 7. So that was our first. And to make sure you're on track, you want to count your stitches. You should have 8, and then you've skipped 1 stitch here. So rows 8 through 12 are exactly the same. We're going to cover row 8 here, and then I'll ask you to complete up to row 12 before we proceed with the next part of the thumb. So to begin row 8, you just want to chain 1 and turn your work. And we want to have 1 slip stitch in the back loop only of every stitch, so we need a total of 8 stitches. Now that completes row 8. Go ahead and work rows 9 through 12 exactly the same. Just start by chaining 1, turning your work, making 8 slip stitches. And when you've finished row 12, come back to this video. We'll talk about the next step. So once you've made it through to row 12, your thumb piece should look something like this. Now we're going to continue on, and we're going to be increasing. So instead of going this direction, we're going to be going out this way. So it's going to be kind of a mirror. Once you flip, when you fold it in half, it'll be exactly the same. So in order to make that happen, we have to increase to make the work go out this way. So for row 13, we want to chain 1 and recognize that this is the flat edge of the thumb. So that means we want to work in the first stitch there. Again, working in slip stitches in the back loop only. So we're going to make 1 into every stitch, except for the last one we're going to make 2. So that was our first. We should have a total of 8 stitches to work in. So in that 8th stitch, we want to make 2 stitches. So I've got 7 stitches here, so in my 8th stitch I want 2. So we're going to have a total of 9 stitches for row 13. For row 14, we're going to chain 1, turn our work, and we're going to find the first stitch and make 2 stitches there. So we're increasing right here at the beginning. This is the chain that I just made, so we're not working in that. We want to find that first stitch and make 2 slip stitches into that back loop only. So that's 1 and 2. And now make 1 slip stitch into each of the remaining stitches. Now for row 14, we need to have a total of 10 stitches. So you want to count that real quick and move on to the next row. Row 15, we're just going to chain 1, turn our work. We're recognizing that this is the flat part of the thumb, so we don't want to do our increasing here. So we're going to find the first stitch and make a slip stitch. And we want to do that all the way across the row until we've reached the very last stitch. Then we're going to increase by adding another stitch. So that was 9 stitches, so I should have 1 stitch remaining, and that last one gets a little bit hard to see because it's really squished up there since we're doing the increasing. But we want to make sure we get 2 slip stitches into that very last stitch. And for row 15 we'll have a total of 11 stitches. So bear with me now, we're almost done with this thumb. For row 16 we want to chain 1, turn our work, and this is the side where we're increasing, so we want to find that first stitch that isn't our chain. So my chain's right here, first stitch is right there. Make 2 slip stitches into that back loop only, and then 1 slip stitch into the back loop of the remaining stitches. So once you finish row 16, we should have a total of 12 stitches. For row 17, we want to chain 1, turn our work. We're not increasing on this side, so we want to make 1 slip stitch into the first 11 stitches. Now we want to locate that very last slip stitch. Again, it's generally pretty difficult to see, but we want to make 2 slip stitches into that last stitch. So for row 17 we'll have a total of 13 stitches. This is the last row of the thumb. We want to chain 1 and turn our work. So for row 18 we need to have a total of 14 stitches, which is the number that we started with on this end. So since we're increasing on this side, we want to locate our first stitch there, just right here. Make 2 slip stitches into that back loop, and then 1 slip stitch into each of the remaining stitches. Again, we'll have a total of 14. So once you're finished with row 18, we're ready to bind off and start shaping the thumb. Something I wanted to briefly mention is about the size difference here that you may see from the section where you increased to the section where you decreased. Now typically this side, even though the stitch count is going to be correct, it may end up looking or being slightly shorter than where this one comes to. And that's okay. That generally is due to tighter stitches as we're increasing. So what I like to do is just finger block that a little bit, pull it down so that when you fold it together they roughly come to the same point. Okay, so with that in mind, we want to bind off and again leave ourselves a pretty long tail, about 8 to 10 inches or so. And instead of pulling the tail through this loop, I'm just going to pull the loop all the way through. Okay, that's going to make a little bit neater of a bind off. Now you're going to need your darning needle, and you want to thread where you just bind it off right on that darning needle. And now we're just going to fold the thumb in half, and we're going to grab just this top loop here and pull it through. And that's going to pull them together. What we want to do is create a drawstring here, and so we do that by weaving in and out just like this. And we're going to be grabbing the topmost loop that we can find. So it typically ends up being part of that chain one where we did all of those rows for the side where we didn't actually increase or decrease. So since I've worked my yarn out this way, I'm going to work back through, and I'm just going to catch the topmost loop that I can find and pull that through. And then the very next row, I want to make sure I'm not skipping anything because we don't want to have a hole there. And then just work it back out and in. And out. And then just keep doing that all the way around the thumb. Then once you've made it all the way around, just back and forth, then if you just pull on that strand real tight. Now, one thing you want to be careful of, especially if you're using this recommended yarn, this stuff likes to untwist when you're weaving it in. So if you're going back and forth, it will have a tendency to twist. So if that's the case, you want to make sure you twist that up again before you pull to make this drawstring bind off. Otherwise, you're just going to pull the yarn and it's just going to break, and it's not going to draw up the thumb. So you just want to hold this securely and then just pull on the thumb. And you want to do that as tight as you can with, again, making sure that you're not going to break your yarn there. And it's going to draw up real nicely, just like that. Okay, so that's the idea. We don't want any extra bulk there. Now we just need to secure this drawstring bind off, and I do that by just making several laps all the way around and around. And I'm just going to feed it in through the stitches. You can really only get a few at a time. But I like to try to get it as close to the opening as possible. You don't want it to go too far down. And once you've made a complete circle, then you can go ahead and pull it tight again. That's going to close it up even better. And you just want to watch your yarn. You can see it is going to start to fray a little bit just because it's the roving style. But as I mentioned, as long as you're making sure it's twisted, then you'll be able to pull on it and it's not going to break. Once you get to the point where you're comfortable with it being secure, then we can just go ahead and trim off that tail. So the next thing and the last part that we need to do to finish off our thumbs is just to sew up this side here. And I like to use the tail that was from the other side to accomplish that. So we just want to thread that onto our darning needle. And the main thing we want to do is make sure we're not missing any of the stitches. So since it's coming from this side, I'm just going to go ahead and grab this loop here. And then we're going to work back and forth. Okay, we're not going to do a whip stitch or anything like that. We want to hide these stitches a little bit better. So we're going to do that by just going back in this direction. And then back this way. And then we'll just repeat that for each of the stitches. Now it's best if you can line them up. And I'm really just catching the top loops there. So you can see I'm catching this top loop of this side and then the top loop of that side. Okay, so once you've finished sewing that together, then the way I like to weave this in, just to make sure it doesn't come undone, is go around the center of the thumb opening just like we were doing before. So this is going to make sure that we have even more security around that drawstring so it doesn't come undone. Plus we're also weaving this in a very tight part of our crocheted work here, so it's going to limit the possibility of this end coming back out. So once you're confident that that's woven in, then we can just trim that off. And there, that completes the thumb. So when you're looking at this in terms of the mitten, we'll have the longer side come down, the shorter side of course coming up here. And then we can just sew it on to the rest of our mitten. So here's what your mitten will look like when you're just about finished here. So as I mentioned before, you want it to measure about 9 inches from the middle here all the way up to the top. Once you've determined you have the right side, it works out better if you can bind off down here at the bottom in the wrist section of the mitten. And that's because we want to keep the same strand to sew it together and then to gather up the fingers up here at the top. So if you can make that happen, that's going to work best. That's what I'm going to demonstrate here. When you bind off, you want to make sure you leave about a 2-foot tail, and that's going to give you more than enough to sew this thing completely together. But we want to have enough so that we can go all the way up the side and sew the thumb on, and then continue all the way up and drawstring bind off the fingers. So once you've cut yourself a tail that's plenty long enough, then you can just pull on that working loop so that you can pull the tail all the way through. And now you're going to need a couple of supplies to make this happen. I like to use these locking stitch markers, and you're going to need 2 of them, or if you don't have these, you can use safety pins or even bobby pins. What we're going to use that for is to let us know where to put the thumb. So we have our thumb that we've completed earlier, and the next thing you want to decide is if this is going to be the right or the left mitten. So it's going to be the same for each side. The only difference is going to be which side the seam is on. So if you're making your right-handed mitten, then the opening is going to be right here next to your thumb. I'm going to be working on the left hand because I've already finished crocheting the right hand. So I'm working on the left, so I'm going to be sewing with my seam over here to the right. To determine where you want to put your thumb, you want to make sure your fingers are all the way up to the edge, and then you just want to pull that over. And that's going to give you an idea of where it's going to sit. The first thing that I like to do is take the stitch marker right inside where my thumb is and catch one of the stitches that's right there close to the middle of my thumb there. And then I'm going to just catch the stitch on the top part. And this is why the locking stitch markers really come in handy, because you can just lock them in place. And so that's where this part of the thumb is going to be attached to later on. So now we need to gather up the end so we know where to join that part. And we'll do that in the same way. Just grab the stitch there at the bottom, and then grab a stitch that's on the top part, and then lock that in place. It's a little difficult to do one-handed, but you might be able to have someone help you out with this. Okay, so once you have that in place, then we know exactly where we need to sew on the thumb. So we can slide our hand out of there and we can start sewing up the side. Now you're going to need to pick up your darning needle and thread that long tail that we just cut a few minutes ago. And we're going to start at the bottom here. And instead of doing a whip stitch, like where we're going in and out in the same direction, we're going to do it a little bit differently because this is a roving style yarn. And when you do the whip stitch and you're going in the same direction, it has a tendency to untwist the yarn. And that can make it a little weaker. So we're not going to do that. We just want to figure out which side the long strand is on. So this is the tail from the start. We'll weave that in later. So I've got the long end over here, and I just want to grab just the back loop on the opposite side and then just pull that through. Okay, and then we'll look over here and grab the next stitch over. I'm just going to grab just a single strand and then grab that back loop and pull it through. And then the next stitch over and then grab that back strand on the other side. We just want to do that for every one of our single crochet stitches for the wrist. So one cool way to think about this pattern is you can break it into 3 sections. We have the wrist section, the hand section, and then the finger. And so it's easy to kind of put this thing together and make this pattern come to life if you can really recognize which section you're working on. Okay, so when you've finished sewing up the side there of the wrist, then we're ready to tackle the woven section. And there's one thing I will mention about this part. As you've noticed, there are some small holes, just as a characteristic of this stitch, and we want to try to minimize the holes near this seam because when we have it on, it's going to stretch a little bit as we're wearing it, so we don't want these holes to be right around the seam because that kind of makes it look like it's not very well made. So what I like to do is I like to catch the stitches or the parts of the stitches that are a little bit further down so that they're sort of below where these holes are. Now it's going to apply a little bit more once we actually start working around the thumb. Right here we just have a small section there, but if you look at this stitch right here, so this is my woven stitch. I've got the 1 and the 2 of the woven stitch, so the first stitch, the second stitch. And I like to catch this little bar right there. And then you can catch just the top of the stitch on the other side. Okay, so this might take a little bit of just trial and error. That's really what it's been for me, is just trying to figure out which parts of the stitch work the best in order to hide some of these little holes around the seam. So when you have that first stitch in place, then we can go ahead and start working on the thumb. So you want to get that, and this is much easier to work into because it's pretty dense, but we do want to make sure that we're putting a lot of stitches in this because, again, we don't want any holes around this seam. So we'll just go ahead and put this right where it's supposed to be. You can remove this bottom stitch marker. And what I'm going to do is flip it over because I need to work from this direction now. And I'm just going to grab that bar, just like I showed you over on the other side. And then grab the thumb and just find the bottommost point. And you can just grab one of those stitches. And then now find the next spot over on the other side. So again, I'm I'm going to grab that bar and then just pull that through all 3 of those pieces. So once you get that first stitch in, it's much easier because you've got at least the thumb laying where it's supposed to, and we don't really have to go through all 3 pieces anymore once we get that on until we reach the next stitch marker up here. So then I'm just going to continue along, just grabbing the bars that are just below where those holes are, and then just grabbing the stitches on the thumb. And you definitely want to stick to the side of more stitches. So it's better to have more stitches than it is to have fewer, because again, we don't want there to be any holes. So So when you reach the top part of the thumb, where you've reached the stitch marker here, I find that's easier if you turn it around the other side. It's a little bit easier for you to see what's going on. And so I'm not quite there. I have one more stitch that I'm going to put in place. Now with that in place, I'm just going to catch a stitch on the thumb, and here's where we're going to work in all 3 layers again. You can go ahead and remove this stitch marker, and then catch the stitch here that's on the front half, and then jump across and catch the stitch that's on the other side. Pull that through all 3 layers. And now we can just flip it over and start working. We're going to work in the same way that we just did, just working on this one side of fabric and the thumb. Okay, so once you have the thumb completely sewed on, it's not a bad idea to go ahead and try this on and just make sure that there aren't any holes showing, because it's pretty easy to miss a couple of these stitches. So once we're sure that's okay, then we just want to work the tail back up to this opening here so that we can continue sewing the top part. So I typically just work it through a dense part of the pattern. Okay, and that sets you up so that you can finish sewing up this side. And we're going to do it the same way that we did just right here. So I have just a couple more stitches here to go. I've finished up sewing up where the woven stitches are, and now I just want to work through, remember we had those 2 single crochets? So I'm working through those now, and I want to catch each of the slip stitches. And I'm just working in the back loop of those stitches in case it's a little difficult for you to see here. Okay, now finally what we need to do is just draw up the fingers, and we're going to do this the same way that we drew up the thumb. So we have our tail already coming out from this side, so we want to catch just the top part of each of these stitches and work in and back out, so just the top. And we want to do just the top part because we don't want this to be bulky. So if we catch further down on the stitch when we draw this up, then that's going to either push those stitches in or it's going to pull them out, and it's just going to be a lot bulkier than what we want. So that's why we need to make sure we're putting all of the stitches in the same place and as close to the edge as possible. Okay, so we really only need to go one time around, and you want to double check your yarn. Just make sure that it hasn't come unwound throughout this process of sewing before we pull on this, because we want to make sure our yarn doesn't fall apart. Then we can just gather this up, pulling pretty tight but also making certain we're not going to break our yarn. That's going to draw up the fingers and it'll close it. And the last step is just to work this tail around in that circle, and that's going to weave in the end, it's going to secure the drawstring, and it's going to be the last step that we have to finish our mittens. So for this step, depending on how long of a tail you have left, you at least want to go one time around. But if you can, I would go 2 or 3 times around just for extra security. So once you're sure that that is secured, then we can just cut that tail off. And all that's left is just to weave in this final tail, and I like to do so on the inside, so I'll just kind of turn up the wrist and then just weave this in separately. This concludes our tutorial for the woven mittens. Stay tuned for more awesome free patterns and video tutorials, as well as techniques and everything that you need to get your crochet fix at BHookedCrochet.com.